Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this regular meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee, and I'm joined by Council Members Rosendahl and Koretz. It's 2:13, and we're going to begin today with our general public comment. Right now I only have one card, but if anybody would like to offer general public comment about an item not on the agenda, please fill out a card and bring it forward right away. We will then consider our open session matters, and then we will retire to executive session to hear the closed session matters. So let's begin with public comment, and the only speaker that I have so far is George Abrahams. Mr. Abrahams, welcome.
Anytime you see...
Your name for the record.
Oh, George Abrahams, People for Livable Communities. Okay. Anytime you see something versus the city of Los Angeles, it's like pain. It's nature's way of telling you you're doing something wrong. And tomorrow there's going to be a vote on the Hollywood Community Plan, and the council will have a choice of either sending it back to planning or getting sued and most likely losing. And in which case you'll be back here in this committee seeing infrastructure advocates versus the city of Los Angeles, Fix the City versus the city of Los Angeles, East Hollywood Coalition versus the city of Los Angeles, and People for Livable Communities versus the city of Los Angeles, because you'll have to wind up paying all the plaintiffs' attorneys. And the reason is because there are so many flaws in the Hollywood Community Plan. The data is not current in the draft EIR. The temp is 7 years old. The last infrastructure study is 11 years old. And data additions in the various editions that were done in the last few days are not sufficient. It still requires a full recirculation of the EIR. And other problems, upzoning is not allowed if the build-out is not reached and the population and commercial occupancy is not at its maximums. And currently is a 25% commercial vacancy rate in Hollywood. And the infrastructure is not mitigated because there's no funding for the increase in the infrastructure for the proposed density. The increase in street traffic is not mitigatable, and the 205 temp says so. The streets can't be widened. So just a Bondo job with a few cans of spray paint in the additions is just not going to do it. So for all these reasons, the HCP is fatally flawed, and you should just save yourself the pain.
Thank you, Mr. Abrams. That's the only card I have, so that will close public comment for this meeting. That brings us to item number 4, which is being continued, which will then bring us to item number 5.
Good afternoon. Item number 5 is City Administrative Officer Report relative to the authority for the City Attorney to accept $282,000 in grant funding for the continuation of the LA Impact Grant Award.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mara Corrala with the Office of the CAO. The report before you is the City Attorney's request to accept grant funding related to the Los Angeles Interagency Metropolitan Police Apprehension Crime Task Force, also known as the LA Impact Program. Funding in the amount of $282,000 will support the salaries and fringe benefits of 1 full-time prosecutor and 1 full-time paralegal to investigate and abate public nuisance properties, as well as prosecute individuals and or entities that commit and or permit criminal activities within these properties. There is no matching requirement for this grant. It is recommended that the City Attorney's Office be authorized to accept the grant funding in the amount of $282,000.
Thank you, and I'm always pleased to see that we're aggressively seeking grant funding like this. This grant seems to go to fund fiscal year 2011-2012. Will there be a continuing support for 2012-2013 for this same function?
I believe the City Attorney's Office might be better able to answer that question.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Bill Mangan, Chief Budget Analyst, City Attorney's Office. As you know, the grant funding at the state level is changing hands from one agency to We have been told that there will probably be a continuation in this current fiscal year coming up, and that the changes, if they occur, will be in the following year. So we expect, in answer to your question, a continuation for at least one more year, uninterrupted,
When do you expect that you'll get final notification of that?
within 60 days.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Members?
No, it's great.
Okay, without objection, then, the recommendations will be the action of this committee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That works.
That brings us to item number 6.
Item number 6 is a board review report dated April 11, 2012, and June 6, 2012, relative to delinquent account receivables for the Housing Department.
Good afternoon. Before you begin, I apologize due to my oversight. Mr. Englander has been here since just after I introduced members, so I apologize, Mr. Englander. I want to recognize your presence as well. Welcome.
Todd Bowie with the Office of Finance, and before you have a request to write off accounts attributable to the Housing Department, accounts in excess of $5,000. And so these have been reviewed by the Board of Review and recommended for write-off to the Council.
So a small number of these have already passed the statute of limitations, and most of them were referred to collections and have been delinquent for over a year, I gather.
That's correct, sir.
What steps have been taken among that larger share of them to actually collect on the debts?
In the broader sense,
Yeah.
the Housing Department does use collection agencies for the collection of debt, and they've also actually recently sent forward a transmittal to council to begin the process potentially of implementing a lien process for their accounts receivable that appears very promising as well.
How many different collection agencies were utilized for these debts that are being written off?
I believe they're using, these are the over 5,000 accounts, so they are coming through the Office of Finance.
Okay. Members? Mr. Englander?
Thank you. And by the calculations, it looks like on the April 11th and June 6th reports, those are a total of $8.1 million in total. It's the 5.7 and the 1.7 million.
The amounts are actually a bit smaller than that in terms of what's coming to the council. It's for instance, in the April 11th report, it's approximately $300,000 that's being.
I was talking about everything, not just what was coming to the council.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so everything, the total of those were about a little over 8 million.
Yes, this year the Board of Review has written off probably around 300 million in total. Most of it's under 5,000, however.
Right. It seems like an awful lot of write-offs, well over 10,000 uncollected accounts.
Yes, a lot of this is attributable to the fact that we just haven't been very proactive in the write-off process in years past, and so we really have a significant backlog from very old years.
And is it the practice of not, I understand the practice of not being diligent in writing off, because we've got a lot of departments that have old paper that is uncollectible. And having said that, what about the proactive side of the actual collections? Is this just inherent in these types of accounts that we're always going to have a percentage? And what does this percentage, how does this compare to in the industry?
It is, at the end of the day, obviously your best opportunity to collect is at the very beginning of the process, and over time, obviously, that diminishes. So at the point at which you go to collections, you're definitely never going to collect 100% of any of these accounts. There's a lot of various reasons, and it kind of varies from receivable type to receivable type. There's a lot of different nuances. It could be property ownership changes. It could be deceased. It could be bankruptcies, things of that nature. There's a lot of different things that come into play in terms of the inability to collect. So on the kind of in the broader spectrum of things, I think the more that we do at the beginning of the process to effectuate collections, the better off we'll be, because really at the end you're just hoping to be able to make a collection with those types of remedies at the end of the process, but it's definitely not anywhere near a 100% type of collection.
You're right, no, I get that, but when we see the numbers like 22,236 uncollected accounts, those are ones that are representing, those are the less than the $5,000
Yeah.
ones, correct?
Yeah.
It just seems like a huge number that, I don't know if that, again, jives with what is considered normal or standard operating practices or statistics in the industry, and I guess we have no way of really knowing that.
It is difficult to say. It's hard to compare, especially government versus private. Say this, in my observation, we had a lot of difficulties several years ago that now we're kind of seeing coming out. A lot has changed since then. A lot of these departments have since implemented brand new systems. And so what we're kind of seeing here is some kind of cleaning out. But I think going forward, I think we are seeing a great deal of improvement, especially as like housing department, for instance, the police department, fire department. They've all implemented new systems in the last few years, a lot in response to a lot of the issues and questions that have come up over the years regarding this very subject. And I think we are seeing that these departments are improving in their overall revenue intake.
So I guess my last question on that then is, out of all these, so just have some kind of sense, if we're looking at roughly 22,000 uncollected accounts, that's out of how many? What's the universe?
Well, for housing department, I believe on an annual basis, I think their annual billing is around 350,000 accounts annually, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Rosendahl.
Yeah, just for clarity here, the collection rate for the types of invoices involving remains at 93%. LAHD report that the invoices involved were from 2006 through 2009 were deemed uncollectible either because they exceeded the statute of limitation or have been in collections for more than 365 days. At its meeting, the board approved the write-off of 22,236 uncollectible accounts received totaling nearly $5.7 million, representing accounts 5.7 million representing accounts less than 5K. Is that right on that?
Correct.
And then the other comment, of course, says, at the meeting, the board approved the write-off of 10,396 uncollectibles. LAHD accounts receive a total of approximately 1.7 representing amounts of and these accounts do not require council approval to be written off. Regarding the 33 accounts requested for council approval for write-off, they were deemed uncollectible as they have either exceeded the statute of limitation or have been collectible. Okay, so this is the facts, and then you made a comment about maybe at a point we weren't more aggressive or announced statute of limitation. We hear from constituents all the day these astronomical numbers of uncollectibles, and we need to collect it, and this would definitely help our balance. What is our ability to take a deep breath and outline all these and point it in one sentence what the amount was and why we deemed it uncollectible, or if there's an ability to say those that the statute of limitations have let out, which ones are these? I want a complete accounting, if possible, of all of these different things, so that once and for all, instead of hearing some outrageous comment about uncollectibles, I don't care who's making that comment, that we have documented and explained it, be it good, bad, or the ugly. I'm not trying to do anything other than the facts suggest. Is that possible to get that together?
I think that we're getting close to that, sir. And we do have a quarterly report that we put out. We just put out a new one that I think also starts to move in that direction. That'll probably be before your committee in the near future. And then going into the fourth quarter report, we can certainly take more instruction, and definitely I have my eye towards being able to shed more light on this topic, because I think there is a lot of misinformation, and I think that the numbers that we've seen are very misleading. And honestly, I think that the upside, the revenue upside that accounts receivable represents is less than what people might believe. And I think that the actual amount of billing that we do is lesser than what people might believe.
That has to be clearly put out there. And then those that are somewhere near a drop-dead date of eligibility have to be repumped out to the various groups and say, look, if we don't do this in this period of time, we're going to lose this, that, and the other. And I'd like to see that as well, so that we get a comfort level that not only are we going back to old ones, but present ones that maybe the statute hasn't, and get clarity on it, so that we have that aspect done. Can we have that too?
Absolutely, I agree, and certainly do my best to accomplish that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Kretz.
What's the highest percentage that we ever pay to a collection agency?
Offhand, I don't know I don't recollect exactly what the percentages are, but it's generally in the high teens to maybe 30-ish%, and some of them are skew higher when you're in the secondary collections.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if, as some of these get old and close to uncollectible, if there are firms out there that would still have a shot at collecting them if they were given a higher percentage to go after them.
We do have that in our secondary collection contracts, and we are actually renewing our contracts now, so we're going through the RFP process for that. And in there, we do have, firms do have the ability to bid basically at a rate that they feel is going to be worthwhile for them to effectuate collections. And so what we tend to see is then the primary collection agencies will bid at a little bit lower rate, and then they'll bid at a little bit higher rate on the secondary collection aspect. And so I suspect to see that furthered and continued in the next round. We also are adjusting the timelines in accordance with the core recommendations, so there'll be shorter period of collection activity, so we'll get to the secondary a little bit quicker in that regard and through to the write-off process quicker.
So I don't know if anyone's ever looked at this. I mean, I've done a little bit of collections myself, and I wonder if we always take the low bid in collections, because sometimes, especially for the most uncollectible stuff, if you're not giving them more money to use additional techniques, you may actually make it harder to collect if you pay less, even though that might be counterintuitive.
Right.
Do we look at those factors?
Yes, and actually, in our case, what we do is in the scoring, we don't. It's not a low bid. We actually look at the entire RFP, and so the rate that they're proposing is one component of it, but it's not the most significant component. We're really, especially looking at experience and success in the industry. So it's not a low bid per se, and in actuality, in terms of the way we've structured in the ordinance, is that their amount, their contingency fee, is actually added on top of what's owed the city, so we stay whole in terms of what we recover, and thus the concern about how much they're taking off the top in terms of what's due to the city is a much lesser concern.
So do we do anything like give different groups a piece and let them compete with and see how they do? I mean, I know there are some cities that will say give similar groups of collections to 5 different companies, and then one does a lot better than the rest, they get more business. Do we have any kind of system like that?
We have the ability to do that. We have multiple vendors currently for primary and secondary. Probably at this point, most departments aren't engaged in that. You will have a different primary from a secondary. Finance right now is referring to multiple agencies. So we are starting to build up some ability to kind of compare how they're doing. But different departments will kind of set up their own systems. But I do agree, I think that is something that we want to continue to look more at, because there is something to that competitive environment that I think would help spur collections.
So collections are all still done by each department with different systems and different methods?
That's correct. All these systems at this point, though, they've like I mentioned, a lot of these systems are newer. And so these departments have been able to build up interfaces with the collection agencies, and so they are doing a lot of direct referrals through their systems now.
Are we doing much in terms of trying to centralize our collections process and the steps that we take, and have each department taking similar steps? Or are we still, is each department pretty much on their own?
The collections processes right now, more or less, each department is managing its own collections process, And what we do have is we have a pool of contractors maintained by the Office of Finance. And each department is pretty well following a standard course of action relative to the collection agencies. That's probably not speaking to exactly what you're probably referring to, which would be basically where it was centrally controlled, I imagine. That paradigm we do not have presently. But we definitely, are in a place now where we have a much more automated system than we ever have as a city.
And do we have a set of best practices and make sure each department is using them?
We do. We have guidelines for each department to follow that stipulates, how they should go through this process. We also, through our centralized accounts receivable reporting system, have the ability to view and see the activity relative to all the accounts in the city, except for the fire ambulance billings, which are outside the scope of that presently.
Thank you.
We certainly have a blueprint with the core recommendations, and with the collections sheriff coming in. I think we have a real opportunity to improve the quality of our collections right now. But another significant problem that the city has had, as you alluded to, is not just on the collection side, it's also on the writing off side. We do have to also be clear when debts do become uncollectible that they are, and accept that as such. And that's what's before us today, members. So if there's no objections, I would suggest that it be the action of this committee to approve the recommendations.
Agreed.
All right. So that brings us to item 7, which I would propose as a consent item unless anyone has a concern or question.
I have just a question.
Okay. Go ahead and introduce.
Item number 7 is a motion, Weston Corretz, relative to the reappropriation of funds from fiscal year 10-11 to 11-12 for the Pico Neighborhood Council to pay 2 outstanding demand warrants for Star Inc.
And is done here? Is there somebody maybe from the, well, what's the nature of your question, Mr. Englander? Maybe we can see if somebody else can answer it.
My question is done here? No, my question was actually going to be for Dunn. I wanted to find out if they were the ones that actually misplaced the demand warrant, or was it the neighborhood council themselves? And that was my question.
Okay. Is there anyone from the CAO's office who might be able to help us with that, or?
No. My understanding, and speak with the budget analyst from the CAO's office, is that she wasn't aware of this displacement as well.
Okay.
Because I don't want to get into the whole why, but it creates a whole why part of it. So I don't know what their timing is to make this payment. What we could do is...
I'm expecting that they probably want to encumber it
I would think.
now, before the end of the fiscal year.
If we could, I don't have a problem with moving it on to council, as long as we can get, somebody can call me from Dunn.
Okay. So,
To answer the question even offline.
on the assumption
I'm
that somebody's
comfortable with
listening, or if they're not listening, then
We
maybe
will
ensure that-
communicate with the department to make sure somebody's there for council.
And if...
that. Or before then.
Or before then.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
have them
I
respond
don't
to
mind
Mr.
talking
Englander
offline, I
before
just want to know
council.
the answer.
Very well.
Okay. Well, with that then, if you're all right with that, Mr. Englander, we'll go ahead and, without objection, make the recommendation the action of the committee.
I think a point was made, though, frankly, that there should be a staff person whenever there's an issue of any kind, just to give us the clarity that Mr. Englander was asking for. But obviously, I agree, let's move forward with it, and hopefully offline we'll get that comfort level, that's all.
Okay. That brings us to item number 8.
Item number 8 is communication from the Department of General Services relative to authority to negotiate and execute a lease for the City Attorney's Office at One World Trade Center in Long Beach, California. Council referred above matter to Budget and Finance Committee on May 1st, 2012.
Good afternoon. Reggie Jones Sawyer, General Services Department. Before you have a a request from the department to begin, or actually we're already in negotiations with One World Trade Center to house the city attorney's office in a consolidation effort in hopes that they'll be able to have more efficiencies, reduce the cost of services, messenger services, and the back and forth that they have to go through between Long Beach and San Pedro. Ultimately, it's been resulting in a lot of lost work time. The offices that have been identified are about 3,655 square feet. The department is, you should know, as General Service believes, even though there's a $90,000 difference, we also believe we can get that number down. We will be able to negotiate that number down a bit, so it won't be quite $90,000, and my staff has assured me that it won't be as high. In addition, I believe you've received some correspondence from the city attorney's office explaining how over the last 6 months or so, they've saved approximately $276,000 in annual revenue by consolidating other offices and saving the general fund quite a bit of money. Staff is here from the city attorney's office to maybe go into further detail of why it is so important for them to consolidate their branches into this one office.
Okay. And who's going to
Or
do that?
maybe not.
Well-
Dr. Special Assistant City Attorney. To my right is Earl Toms, the Chief of our Criminal Division, and to my immediate right is Alois Phillips. She's the Supervisor of our former San Pedro branch office. As Mr. Jones points out, the efficiencies we described when we were last in committee in front of the council, and Mr. Englander, you asked a question regarding the difference between our branch operations and a satellite, a courthouse satellite office. We didn't answer your question then, but I would like to answer it now. This would not be a satellite office. This would be our San Pedro branch operation office. And that's the reason for the need for this amount of space and its proximity to the courthouse. So it would bring a tremendous amount of efficiencies to our San Pedro branch operation.
Okay. Members?
My first question is pure and simple. Can't we find space in the city of Los Angeles and having to go to another town, for God's sake?
Mr. Chairman and honorable members of the council, my name is Earl Thomas. I'm the Chief of the Criminal Division. Thank you for that question, Councilman Rosendahl. I'll try and answer it and try and assist you all as best I can today. We would love to find a location which is in the city of Los Angeles. This is not something that we want to do at all. This is something that we are actually being required to do because we don't control where our criminal cases are going to be heard. What we're really trying to do here is we're trying to bring this operation as close to the courthouse as possible because it really is essential to operate effectively to have our prosecutors located near the courthouse. What happened many years ago, unfortunately, I think it was around the year 2000, the courts, in order to decrease their budget deficits, formed an ad hoc committee to figure out ways for the court to save money. That committee met for over a year and came up with a plan that unfortunately affected our San Pedro operation at that time. At that time, our criminal cases were heard in the San Pedro courthouse. You all know where that is. It's actually right across the street from our San Pedro branch operation. So at that time, our prosecutors could literally just walk across the street to prosecute their criminal cases. Well, the court committee decided, unfortunately, that they were going to take criminal cases out of the San Pedro courthouse and move all of those cases to Long Beach in order to save money.
How far physically is it away?
It's across the bridge, sir, so it's a good 30 to 40-minute drive to get from the San Pedro branch to the Long Beach courthouse. I don't know what the number is exactly in terms of miles, but it's a good haul. And The reason they did this, or the way in which they did this, is the courts basically said, well, we can't afford to pay for the bailiffs that are necessary to be present in a criminal case. So they simply removed all the bailiffs, leaving our criminal cases without the security that's necessary in order to do those trials. And they moved the whole operation to Long Beach. And we opposed it. We opposed it and we objected to it, but it was a done deal. There were several other court closures that took place, but that's the one that impacted the city of Los Angeles. That left us in the anomalous and unfortunate situation where we have a branch located on City Hall property in San Pedro, but our prosecutors, and there are basically 8 prosecutors that staff that branch, now all had to go to the Long Beach courthouse to prosecute and try our cases. We didn't have any space in the Long Beach courthouse when this took place, and no one wanted it. The judges didn't want it. The city of Long Beach prosecutors who staffed that courthouse did not want it. The district attorney's office, who has prosecutors in that courthouse, did not want it, and we didn't want it. Yet, that's where our cases wound up. So, in effect, we have to follow our cases. Now, what happened was, because it really is impossible to prosecute criminal cases, interview witnesses, and conduct that kind of business without any office space, we begged the presiding judge and the judicial staff at the Long Beach courthouse to give us some space. I know this because I was one of the persons who begged them to do this. They didn't have any space, but they graciously gave us the only space that they had in that courthouse, which literally was an old closet. That's what it was. It was a beat-up old closet. The cabinets were all broken. And what we did is we converted that little tiny space into a small office, just so our prosecutors would have a place to put their materials, a place to put their case files, a case to do some preparation. But it's woefully inadequate because there's no computer access in that location. There was no, it was ridiculous, basically. And we've lived with that situation up to now. Now, they're closing the courthouse. The old Long Beach courthouse is going to close because they are building the new courthouse. So when that happened, we decided, well, we need to look around.
Who's building that new court?
I'm told it's called the Judicial Partnership, as I recall. That's the name. But it's basically it's a private and state-funded development. And we don't have space in the new courthouse location. So we were forced to look around to see if we could find space near that courthouse where we could have our staff. So the whole idea here is to go back to the way it was, where we had a branch located across the street, and there are a lot of efficiencies which we can talk about and a lot of savings by doing that. But unfortunately, we're still stuck in Long Beach. Now, a question did come up, as Mr. Sato alluded to. It came up when we were before the council, I think about a month or so ago, about, well, why can't we just go back to San Pedro, and what, if anything, can we do to make that happen? I can tell you personally and honestly, we have asked the court and we have tried to convince the judiciary to let us go back to San Pedro, but they're not going to do it. It's just off the table. And the court's budget, as we all can see.
Anybody administrating, if they're going to build a new building, for God's sake, that meant there was some money. I know there's issues with their budget, like there is with everybody else.
Yes.
To the world of insanity. But the reality is, our guys would have to schlep for 40 minutes to get over there, but they have to constantly go back and forth. So you just don't want that drive time of 40 minutes thrown in on top of the reality of the other stuff.
That's correct, sir. It's impossible, and it's impossible to supervise. And also, if we're located next to the courthouse, then my prosecutors When they're in court trying cases, that's fine. But as we all know, from having been on jury duty, there's a lot of downtime. Now, when there's downtime, if we're located across the street, I can bring my prosecutors back from the courthouse, only it's a 10-minute walk, and they can file cases and interview witnesses and do case preparation because they can get there. Right now, if I have to require them to drive for 40 minutes, then that's ineffective, and that's just not going to work. There's also another impact here, which is rather subtle, but I have to mention it, which is the impact on the Los Angeles Police Department. We have to file our San Pedro cases that are prosecuted in the Long Beach courthouse. We have to file those cases downtown. That requires that the police officers in the San Pedro area have to bring their files all the way downtown, have a filing deputy here at headquarters review the case. Once it's reviewed, once it's filed, then they have to schlep it back to the Long Beach courthouse to get it filed. That is an absolute waste of Los Angeles police officer time. It's ineffective. They don't like it. We've spoken to them about it. And it's just, there are many, many inefficiencies. So in a way, this is our last alternative. And that's why we're seeking to get the space across the street from the new location.
Mr. Kretz.
Have you done anything to try and quantify whether we actually save money or not on this? I know we've quantified the rent and the mileage, and we save $27,000 plus against a lease that would be up to $120,000 in year 5. Do we know, have we actually looked at the number of hours that we think we waste and whether we actually save money?
I think that we have done some of that. I think some of the cost savings are built into the figures that Mr. Sawyer gave to you when we started out. But there are courier costs, which we will save because we don't have to courier cases back and forth. There is travel time for the deputies. That's some savings. We haven't, I don't believe that we have calculated out the police officer savings that are created from just having the police to go to the Long Beach location versus having to drive up here. I don't think we have those figures, but that activity occurs every day. Every day the police officers have to bring the cases here because every day there are new filings that have to be reviewed. So that's a constant daily activity.
I mean, intuitively, it sounds like it would be a net savings, plus it sounds like a very inefficient process, but it would be nice to have numbers beyond just the courier and mileage expenses, because I think the real savings is in the staff time and LAPD staff time. And I don't think we've been given those calculations. I mean, intuitively, I can't imagine it wouldn't be a savings, but it would have been nice to have as we look at this issue.
We did create some savings with the closure of our Chatsworth office. We closed our Chatsworth office because our Chatsworth operation was open because those deputies staffed the San Fernando courthouse. And as I understand it, that was a huge savings to do that consolidation. We also pulled all of our prosecutors out of the Hollywood courthouse, which we did not want to do, but we felt that we needed to create these savings, and we did that. And then actually the courts somewhat followed our lead, because now I think there's only there are 3 courtrooms in the Hollywood courthouse, but now there's only 1 courtroom which is open. So instead of having a staff and a deputy at that location, we pull them back, and we only go there when a case is sent there for trial at this point. I think that created some savings also, as reflected in the letter.
Mr. Kretz's question, I think, was a little different one. It is, can we quantify the savings of this move beyond the courier and so on? For example, lost attorney time during the commute and so on. it seems to me that that would be somewhat difficult to put a number on, because it's really not so much of a cost saving as it is an efficiency increase, because the attorney is still going to be on the clock regardless. We don't bill hours here, but you're going to get a lot more work out of your lawyers. You're going to be able to get a lot more effective representation out of your lawyers if they're not schlepping across the bridge 3 times a day.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
So, I guess, I mean, it makes, from an efficiency standpoint, it makes perfect sense to me. The one question I have, Mr. Engel, do you have some questions on this? Okay, well, let me just put my one question out, and then I'll turn it over. And that is, it's $2.50 a foot. That's pretty prime real estate. It seems to me that there's, we didn't do an exhaustive review, but just a quick kind of staff review indicated that there's a number of buildings in the vicinity that are at around $1.25 or so. So I'm just wondering, maybe they don't have 3,500 square feet. Maybe they don't have the facilities that you need for a law firm. I don't know. But has there been a, Mr. Jones, sorry, has there been a search made of surrounding areas? Maybe it's not adjacent to the courthouse, maybe it's a few blocks away, but is there more that we can do to try to drive the cost of this down, find cheaper available space, number one? And then another option, I don't know if this is even feasible, but the Long Beach City Hall, which is right there. I know when we're looking for district office spaces, we often try to look to see if there's civic buildings available, whether a City of Los Angeles or other civic buildings, because sometimes you can get a better rate in having a memorandum of understanding with a government agency rather than a private landlord. So have those sorts of options already been exhausted, or if not, might they be?
I can tell you now, just before I got here, as I discussed this with my staff, we found out just recently there may be some property going on the market that may be at $2 a square foot, not as nice as this building. This building will be a Class A top-of-the-line building. The other buildings that we're going to use in a negotiating posture to bring that drive that price down, we're going to talk to the landlord about that. Not to go into our negotiating strategy, but yes, there's some opportunities there. We're definitely going to look and review that so we can use the best possible price. As far as working with other municipalities outside of the city, a city entity and a Long Beach entity, I don't believe we've done that before.
For example, I think the city sometimes leases space in state office buildings, for example, and I'm wondering.
I think state leases and city buildings.
I don't have any of those? Okay.
I know Assemblyman from the 48th Assembly District was renting space in one of our libraries, and we're paying, and there was discussion of having a congressional office in the San Pedro office. So I've seen it come our way, but I've rarely seen us, if ever, that we've gone and rented in other spaces, other than courthouses.
Okay. Mr. Englander?
Well, in light of, I guess, the recent information, since it appears now that we'll be exploring other options, I don't know if the line of questioning needs to continue, since it sounds like we're going to turn this down on the face of it. But there was a couple things just for clarification. One being, it was stated.
I don't think that was what I had heard Mr. Jones Sawyer saying. I think he said that he was
exploring
other information in negotiating with this lessor.
Yes,
okay, we'll come back to it. But if I could just, thanks, appreciate it. It was stated that we'd close these offices in just the last few months, but I believe it was over the last several years that the offices, that these other courthouses or offices were closed. I just wanted some correction on that. It says here in the letter that it was over the last several years, but it was said in the opening that we'd close these in the last several months. So the letter says here, efforts over the last several years to say consolidating our operations, vacating outlying courthouse space.
Oh, yes, it's over the last several months, sir.
I should read months.
Yes, months.
3 months?
Yes.
Okay. And then also the Chatsworth office, I believe we actually own, it's a partnership with the City of LA and the State of California, that we actually own half the building, and the space we were in was our own.
In the Chatsworth Courthouse?
That's correct.
I'll double check.
Okay? Get back to us on that, if you will.
Okay. But I don't think so, but I'll double check.
Okay. I'm not certain, but I'm close to certain that I believe it's partially owned by us, but let's wait if we could double check that as well. And then, without getting into all the details on this and the dollar amounts, just the conversations that I had with the council member of the district, and I just wanted to relay that with Joe Buscaino, who said that it was his experience that from the drive from where you're currently at now to the courthouse is 10 minutes. This is what he stated and shared with me. And I believe he actually said it on the record as well at the council meeting, but he reiterated it to me as well. And that worst case, maybe it's 15, but he did said it's definitely not 30 or 40 minutes, unless you're walking across the bridge. But he said it's about 10 minutes, and that he didn't want to lose this resource from his district and move it over to Long Beach as well. So I think in the idea that we could continue to explore other space that might be available and have some dialogue offline and figure out a way to make this perhaps and bring, I would suggest we bring Mr. Buscaino into this as well. For now, I'm going to be against it based on the fact that you've also mentioned there's some other space. This is a Class A building, and right now there's some other space that's lower, closer to the $2 square foot rentable space. I think those are the conversations we should have. One other question for clarity: it does say that there are parking spaces that are over and above. It looks like up to $175 a month, depending on the type of parking. Is that over and above the per square foot rate?
Yes.
So the parking is an additional cost?
It's additional.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Well, let me suggest this then, in light of your comments, Mr. Englander. If since there is an ongoing discussion, which we're not going to go into the details of, but since you are having an ongoing discussion, it sounds as though we're not immediately ready to put ink on paper. What I would suggest, unless someone has a strong objection to it, is that we note and file the report, that we instruct General Services to come back here again with further exploration of available office space in the vicinity for cost comparisons for our purposes, and that we instruct the CAO to identify general fund savings, as Mr. Kretz had asked, resulting from this consolidation, as well as any adjustments that might be recommended to those allocations to offset the increased leasing expenses.
To me, all this is good, that you want more thorough answers on this, obviously. I'm very concerned about your efficiency concept. Anecdotally, I've heard what Mr. Englander just said from others, that it doesn't take all that long to get here. They go back and forth, it wouldn't be much of an issue. But I'd like that to be clear why it's an issue, because some people say it's 5 or 10 minutes to go over at different times of the day and everything can be done. We can say where we are. I don't have an answer to that. Obviously, it might be a Class A building, but if it's a building near this courthouse that isn't Class A but can handle what we need to do and is cheaper, of course. Worst case, we have to get space over there. Best case, you make your point, somebody refutes it. I don't want to stop down what our cops need to do and what our lawyers need to do. That's very important to me, but I think it's important we get all those answers to obviously make a decision. That's all.
All right, well, so that's my recommendation. If
I'll second.
there's...
I'll go for it.
Fine. Okay. So that will be the action of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll work with them to bring that back as quickly as we can. All right, so that brings us... All right, that brings us then to the closed session matters, if I'm not mistaken. So general public comment has already been closed. If anybody would like to comment on the closed session items before we go into closed session, you may do so right away, but I haven't gotten any cards, so seeing none, we'll close the public comment on the closed session items as well. Thank you all very much. If you're here to speak about one of items 1, 2, or 3, you may stay. Everyone else, I'd like to ask to leave the room, please. Back in open session, and we are adjourned. Thank you, members.
Did you need to announce that you